Now I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Donna Auston, with several questions. And again, there's a really interesting bridge, I think, between Dr. Brown's comments and what Ms. Auston will be speaking to. So we'd hope that you would answer, in what ways does the marginalization and exclusion of women from mosques have a negative psychological effect on Muslim women, especially those of younger generations? We'd ask that you speak to the concept or phenomenon of unmasking in America today. So how has the state of the mosque access for women influenced the rise of unmasking? And then based on your research, are there significant differences in gender equity in majority immigrant mosques versus majority African-American mosques? I think Dr. Saeed spoke to this, and we'd love to hear from you as well. If so, why? Should American Muslims in general look to American concepts of equality and civil rights in configuring their mosques and organizations? Why or why not? And then just pulling from some of the concepts in Dr. Brown's talk, is separate but equal possible for genders in the American mosque today, or is that a concept that's even relevant to this discussion? Is the notion of separate but equal, that is separate entrances, separation during prayer, is that possible in this framework for genders in the mosque, or is that concept just not relevant to the discussion around where women should be positioned in the mosque?
Bismillah. Can you hear me? Can you see me? Also, I'm a little bit short, so I always worry about podiums in front of me, whether or not my face is visible above them. So hopefully you can hear me and see me, inshallah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I want to thank the organizers, and I want to thank you all for coming out here for this important conversation today. I just want to share start by sharing some additional information about my background, because I have like different versions of my bio, and sometimes I don't include everything. But I think it's relevant here for me to talk about the fact that I do have 15 years or more experience as a mosque administrator, as a board member at various positions on the board, program designer. I also have served on boards of other Muslim organizations. I served on the board of Deen Intensive Foundation for many years, which is an organization, if you're not familiar with it, that runs seminars in traditional Islamic sciences for students in the U.S. and Canada mainly. And so a lot of what we did, in addition to just trying to figure out how to get people to come to mosque, I'm also have some experience trying to figure out, okay, what do we do if we bring this sheikh in and we have a space that we rented? Like, how do we kind of design these spaces so that issues of access and equity, come and are kind of brought to bear on the space that we choose to hold this event in? And sometimes you don't have a lot of control over that, but I just wanted to bring that out there just so that I've been thinking about these things and actually working on them practically for a number of years. So I guess I'll try to just hit the questions in the order that you mentioned them. I want to say that I'm an anthropologist, so I also, like, one of my habits, bad or good, is like coming into a place and kind of noticing who's here, everything I can kind of about the scene. And I think to speak to the first question, which was, to talk about the psychological impact, right, of these issues of mosque access on women. It was interesting to me to note that the women are outnumbering the men by a large majority in this room. And so I think that actually, to me, says a lot about the psychological impact, because you're all here because you understand that our communities are challenged in this way, and you're impacted personally, most likely, by issues of limited access and exclusion in mosque and other spaces that are associated with the Muslim community, life. Right, and the fact that we have such a lopsided representation here says to me that it's probably the case, right, And this is not the first time. Whenever there's a conversation, in my experience, about these types of issues, these issues of women's experience, right, and challenges within the frameworks that we establish in our community in terms of being able to participate, this is pretty much the normal turnout, right? So the men aren't impacted in the same way, or at least they don't see that this is an issue that impacts them in the same way, I should say, because it does impact them. But it's a matter of whether or not you realize and understand that this is an issue that stunts your growth or not, whether it's an issue that impacts you personally. So just wanted to start there. I think there are a zillion stories that I could tell about personal experience, about being excluded, being humiliated, and being marginalized within, even when I was, even when I was on the board. I mean, there are many times when, like, I'm the person on site who is in charge of everything that happens today, and being talked to by men as if and sometimes, men who were, I don't know, a lot of people tell me I don't look my age. I actually have, children who are young adults. And so there's also this issue of, like, people talking to me like I'm a child, which, I'm an African-American woman, and that's something, I was just raised differently. Like, you don't kind of, you treat people right in accordance with, with their lived experience in the world. And many times, just by virtue of being female, right, someone assumes that they can speak to you as if you're a child. And that's, so there's so many personal stories that I could tell, but I'll start by talking about, I had the privilege and the honor of attending the inaugural Juma of the Women's Mosque of America in Los Angeles last year. They just celebrated their 1-year anniversary. If you're not familiar with the project, this was a group of women who, in the Los Angeles area who decided that they were going to begin holding once a month all-female Juma services. There's it's controversial to some people for a variety of different reasons. That experience for me was really interesting because one of the things that they did after the khutbah and the prayer was to kind of have a circle of women, of the women who attended, to talk about, what they just experienced, why they were here, whatever. And it was a really interesting thing. It was a diverse collection of women in terms of racial and ethnic makeup and sectarian affiliation and whatnot, madhabs, whatever. But it was really painful, right, to sit there and to hear women talk about having to pray in broom closets, right? Like actual broom closets. Like, I know we kind of use that phrase as like a half joke, but it's really not a joke, because I've prayed raise your hand if you've prayed in a broom closet, right? Many of us actually, have done that, right? And so, and to talk about, like, how they've been driven away from the mosque, how, and many of these stories were being recounted, like, in tears. It's really challenging, right? When you can't see yourself, right, in an institution, and you can't see yourself reflected in a space, right? And the way that a lot of this is framed is that this is somehow divine decree, that God kind of consented to second-class citizenship for you. And that's a hard pill to swallow. Not just for, we're going to talk, I'll talk a little bit about the younger generations, but I'm an adult woman. I think I'm pretty tough, but that's not an easy thing to have to live with. So I want to refer back to, because I think I'm going to end up coming full circle with a lot of these issues. Some of these things will weave into one another. I want to also talk here about the famous, doll test. It's commonly referred to. If you're not familiar with it, the Brown versus the Board of Education case, which we should all be familiar with. Everyone's familiar with that, right? One of the pieces of evidence that was used in arguing that case before the Supreme Court was this doll test, right? And so these psychologists presented their findings they were presenting children with identical dolls, baby dolls. to play with or to choose as being aesthetically pleasing and desirable, right? And, you know, so they were identical except for their racial makeup. So you have a black doll and a white doll. Same doll, one has black skin, one has white skin, right? And, you know, and what they found, and this test has been repeated many times, was that, you know, there was a large inclination for children to kind of choose these white dolls as being, you know, and this was the black children chose them, you know. So there's something about, you know, when you are in institutions. I mean, in this case, this was used to talk about school segregation and the psychological impacts of school segregation on children. There's something very profound that happens to one's psychology when you are unable to see yourself reflected in a dignified way in the institutions that are supposed to serve you. And so, so I think that when we're talking about, when we're thinking about what the setups, the typical setups in many of our mosques tend to do to our young people, we need to think about this type of research. Now, I don't know if Muslims have gone out and conducted this type of research in our community, but I think if there are any students who are psychology graduate students or anything like that are thinking about that, this would be a really, it's not my field, but I think it would be a really interesting kind of place to discover, because I think we would find what many of us already know anecdotally is that this is extremely damaging, right? Because it's not just the mosque, right? It's not just the space. It's also, and this brings me to my next point, is like, because a couple of the speakers talked about inclusion, I think also we need to think about what inclusion means. It doesn't just mean, can I come into this space and pray in the same room as the men, right? It means, are there women making decisions? I mean, I know from my own experience as a board member on a mosque, I mean, it mattered that I was in that room. It mattered when we were able to, for many years, the mosque that I was serving, that I was serving in, we were located in a really small storefront, right? So we didn't have a lot of space with which to kind of design a prayer area that would be ideal. You know, so we had to have a barrier because because we had, like, you know, half of this room, right, for the whole entire building. So we had to divide the space up because it would be just unruly otherwise. But when it came time, when the community grew enough that we were able to kind of relocate to another place, we were actually able to acquire a warehouse space that we could repurpose however we want. So we were able to put the walls where we wanted to, the bathrooms where we, you know. So it mattered that I was in that room. Like, okay, this is where we're going to put. This is what we're going to do. Are we going to designate a women's area or not? Are we going to you know, where are we going to place the child care room in relationship to the musalla? How, you know, all of these things, like, it mattered that you had women in that room being able to say, nope. Because sometimes, I mean, and I worked with a wonderful group of men who I think thought themselves open-minded, and I think in most cases they were. But there were just things that they didn't have, like, they never had to think about. So it matters to have a diversity of opinions in the decision-making process. It's like, how are we gonna allocate money for programming, right? In terms of which segments of the community is that programming going to serve? What are our priorities in terms of budget? What are, you know, all of these questions, right? It matters that you have somebody's preferably, right? You have, you know, not just kind of these token representations, but you actually have meaningful reflection of what your community, of the makeup of your community in the decision-making process, and empowered to be a part of that decision-making process. So it matters that you don't come into a mosque and feel like you're an afterthought, right? You know, so it's, you know, that somebody actually conceived everything that they do in that space with you in mind, with you as a part of the community. And as I think Sarah alluded to before in her presentation, the implementation of exclusionary practices, right, across a range of spaces and programming and all of these other things, it obviously has an impact on the children, right? If they're not able to if they're not able to see themselves, if they're not able to plug themselves in, whether it's by the dedicated youth programming or by the fact that their mothers are not, I mean, children are very perceptive. I've raised 3 children myself. Like they know if their mothers are not welcome. They know if they're girl children that they're not welcome, right? If their parents drop out of the masjid because they don't feel comfortable, right? How are they going to be attached to the mosque, right? What are they going to think about? Being there and belonging there and feeling like that this is their space when they're older, and having having fond memories, right? It matters that you go to the mosque at a young age and you feel safe, that you feel valued, that you feel protected, that you feel included, and if we're not performing well on these particular points, it has long-term impacts, and they're negative. So that will bring me into I'll try to transition into the next question, which was the question of unmasking, because of course, many of these challenges lead people to stay away from the mosque in various capacities. And I'll be transparent here to say that even though I have a number of years, which I'm grateful for, in serving and being really immersed in community, I'm actually pretty unmasked at the moment, and a lot of it has to do with with being frustrated, not just with the gender issues, with racial issues, and I'm too old for that. I get to a point where I'm just like, it's difficult to feel like you're always fighting to belong in a community that is supposed to be yours. And so I've tried to create community in other spaces. Sometimes that's my home, sometimes that's, with Muslims, right? And so I think that my position on unmasking might be a little bit, controversial to some people, because I don't necessarily see it as an unqualified bad thing. I think that it is important for us to have alternatives, and I think that's part of the reason why the change is slow in coming is not just because change is generally slow in coming, but I think it's also because most of us, if we want to be connected to community, we feel like we don't have choices. We feel like if I don't go to the mosque, where am I going to enjoy Muslim life? Where am I going to enjoy social companionship and fellowship and communion with people who believe and worship like me? And if mosques do not have to compete for that audience, I mean, I hate to use it in terms, to talk about it in like crass market terms, but I'm going to talk about it in crass market terms. If you don't have competition, you don't have to offer a better product. If people need your product, right, they can't live without it, right? In some ways, they feel that they have to have this product, and it's an inferior product. They're going to purchase it anyway because they don't have good choices. They don't have a better product that's cheaper or whatever, right? So I think that one of the things that we've seen in recent years in the Muslim community is this emergence of third spaces, some of this term that some people use. I don't love the term, but this is some of the communities that have emerged have used this in reference to themselves. Places like Tatleef Collective in the Bay Area, or Make Space in the DC area, where they're purposely marketing themselves as not mosques, but offering many of the same services, Jummah prayer, halakas, whatever, right? Other types of social gatherings. So those types of sacred spaces are important, and they're growing, and I think having the choice of access to these types of spaces is something that we should embrace, and not necessarily as something that's just like bad, negative, whatever. I think it needs to be evaluated on a case-by-case basis, and they may solve some of the problems that we have. Quickly, on the question of separate but equal, I think that it's a very dangerous trap to fall into, because as we found in most cases, if we compare it to the kind of the historical, Plessy versus Ferguson precedent where that phrase comes from, we'll find that in most cases separate means unequal. And so I think that we should, it's possible to create spaces where the community feels that, like for example, there might be a quiet room for women with children, right? Where they can go if their children become unruly, whatever. So I think it's possible to have these dedicated spaces for specific purposes, but I think there still needs to be an overall principle of inclusion and free access to the main areas of our spaces, whether they're mosque or third spaces or whatever, so that people don't feel like they're being discriminated against for their particular identity as gender. And in terms of the question of African American versus immigrant-based or immigrant-descendant communities, I think it's one of the things that it's important to think about is the fact that the African American Muslim experience is itself incredibly diverse, right? So you have everything from Worthing communities that descended from kind of the Worthing Muhammad tradition, right? Who I think, in my experience at least, tend to be less barrier-oriented than some other masjids, but then you also have African American Salafi masjids who tend to have barriers more often than not. So I think when we're talking about this, I think we have to be very specific about which communities we're talking about, because it's not just race, but it's also kind of sectarian, madhab, whatever, of these other types of factors that influence, and available architecture, right? Because, in places like New York City, for example, right, it's, what you have as space is sometimes very limited, so you have to do what you have to do with it. And then lastly, I will say, it's also, I think for me, important when talking about the African American Muslim tradition, I think about groups that many people would not include in conversations about the Muslim community. The Moorish Science Temple and the Nation of Islam. The Moorish Science Temple actually had women leaders of their temples in the 1920s, right? So there's a very long historical precedent for greater and more broad models of participation for women in African American Muslim institutions. Then, if you take that full spectrum of African American religious practice, right? And we don't necessarily, every community is not going to adopt every model. For every community, having a woman, in front of a mic is not necessarily the end game. But I think we do need to, for me as a Muslim who lives in North America, those models are also I'm wrapping up just right here. But those models are also important for how I can conceptualize what my possibilities are, right? And I think that we need to make use of all of those, not just the precedents from other times, other places, other areas, but we need to think about what our models are here in North America and figure out what works best for the collective. Thank you.